Provide so abundantly for us. We're mindful of those that are away traveling and those that are away because of their injuries and their illnesses, and just pray, Father, that you will tend to each and every one of their needs and restore the measure of health that they're accustomed, that prayerfully, Lord, we would all once again be back together for worship on Sunday. And Lord, as we gather here together now and prepare to praise you in song, we ask that you would be with the teachers tonight. Lord, help them to reveal their true zeal for your word, and the students may exhibit the true hunger for the truth and the whole truth of your word, and that the way the lessons will be presented in a way that the students will be able to construct the understanding you intend for us to have. And again, just thank you for blessing us with life in a time and a place where we can gather together like this without the fear of persecution. And thank you that we can offer up this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Turn to page 709, 709. How sweet, how heavenly is the sign when those that love the Lord in one another's peace delight, and so fulfill the word. When each can fill his brother's side, and with him bear a part. When sorrows flows from eye to eye, and joy from heart to heart. When free from envy, scorn, and pride, our wishes all above, each can his brother's failings hide, and show a brother's love. When love in one delightful stream through every bosom flows, when union sweet and dear esteem in every action glows. Love is the golden chain that binds the happy souls above, and he's an heir of heaven who finds his bosom glow with love. Dismissed the classes.
It's a delight, it's a delight to see everybody here. I've got an allergy, apparently. It's something I mowed in the grass, so I might be breaking up a little bit, but I hope y'all can get over that. I guess most of y'all here probably are here out of curiosity. Who is this person? Excuse me. Anyway, I got kind of tricked into this affair several weeks ago. Terry approached me and he said, what's your favorite Bible character? I'm hard of hearing. And I thought he said something else. I said, come to me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I'm meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. He says, no, your favorite character. And you know, I don't even have a favorite character in the Bible. So I had to do a little thinking. So I picked out somebody that I admired. And I thought it would be exciting, perhaps, if we guessed who that was. I've got 20 questions, or actually answers here, and I'd like for you to guess who it is. The first ones are obscure, and you won't know by that, but add to that as we go along, and maybe you'll find out who that might be. He was born a slave. He met Jesus outside of a city. He escaped from being stoned to death. He wasn't very persuasive. I searched the scriptures and looked to see who his mother was, and I found none. I looked for his father too. I found none. He later became a soldier. He also became a surgeon. Let's don't say he was ugly, but he probably wasn't, but he could stop a clock. He was called a prototype, but now you should have some kind of suspicion who this might be. He was a sidekick. You know, like Tonto was sidekick of Lone Ranger. His birth name was O'Shea, but that's not what we call him. Anybody yet? No. He became a great military leader. He knew Moses firsthand. Walls would fall down around him. He hung many kings to trees. His name meant Yahweh is salvation. Say that again. Louder, I can't hear you. Joshua it is. Congratulations on number 17. You got it. I'll go on with the rest of them. He was born around 1500 BC. He lived to be 110 years old, and his name is mentioned 218 times in the King James Bible. So that's who it is. I'm very aware of speech and not being able to hear something, but if you talk loud enough, I will hear you, and I might answer something that is not what you're talking about, but anyway, you'll get an answer that you're not exciting about, perhaps. In any case, he was born 1,500 years ago, BC, and his father was none. First time we hear about him was he was basically with Moses. He stayed with Moses a little bit on the way on the mountain before he received the 10 Commandments, and he stayed in the tent afterwards when Moses came back because he wanted to be close to God. He was one of the 12 spies sent into the land of Canaan, and he wasn't very persuasive when he came back. Him and Caleb were the only ones that were, of course, justified before God, and they were later able, both of them, to enter the promised land. But he almost lost his life. If it were not for divine intervention, they were going to stone him because of his outright support of going into the land. And you know, when they entered the land, or were going to enter the land the first time, it was on the the west side of the Great Salt Sea, which is we call the Dead Sea. The second time they entered was on the east side. I wonder why that was. Anybody got any ideas? We don't know for sure, but probably God knew what was going to happen. And so he did not allow them to go in, even get close to it, as they would have to not even cross a river to get there. In any case, the first time we see him fighting, after they crossed the Red Sea, some local king, Amalek, who was the grandson of Esau, started attacking them. And so Moses called Joshua aside and says, get some men and go take care of them. And so Joshua did exactly that. He took some men and they went after them. And Moses said, I will be over here on the hill watching you as you take care of them. And as long as he could hold his arms up in the air, then of course we know that the army would win. If he let his hands down, then Amalek and his soldiers would start winning. And so at that time they started holding up Moses' hands so that they would benefit from his power of being held up. And of course the power was from God. This is probably a good lesson that we should learn, that God's part is huge Man's part is minor, symbolic, if you will. Moses holding his hands up had nothing to do except if it weren't not for God. And this is true all through the scriptures. Man has a small part. God has the best part and the most part and the most beneficial part. It's our duty to do the small part. And we'll talk more about that a little later. In any case, they eventually made it 40 years later to the Jordan River. And God took Moses away and buried him when he died. And before Moses died, he took Joshua before the people and basically told him that he was going to be the leader and let him lead after Moses was gone. He told Joshua that he would be his guide all the way. Every place he placed his foot would become theirs. And he would be with him just like he was with Moses those many years. And he would never forsake him. And remember that, he will never forsake him. Which is kind of confusing if you wait a little bit later as things happen. In any case, Joshua took the lead of the people, and he sent 2 spies over into the land to look out the area and see how it was, and especially to go into Jericho. Well, as things might happen, they went into Jericho and they were recognized as being part of the Israelites on the other side of the river. So they went to a harlot's house, Rahab, and some people call her by a different name. She was also an innkeeper. A lot of times we hear about her and wonder why they went into a harlot's house. Anybody got any idea? No ideas? People were going and coming out of the harlot's house all the time. And that's kind of interesting. They didn't think they'd be recognized, but they were, and she recognized them. We don't come in contact with harlots very often, or prostitutes, by the way we live. I don't know if any of you have ever come in contact with any or not. But we remember many years ago, when we were in school, we had an apartment off campus, and our landlord knew a neighbor real well, and she had to in some fashion leave her house and go someplace else. And so she asked him to rent the house for her. It was diagonal to the house that we were living in our apartment. And so he rented it to this nice lady. And this nice lady told him that people would be coming and going because she had a business to run, and they'd be coming and going. And he eventually found out that she was a madam, and that she was running a house of ill repute. And it like to drove him crazy. He was a fine man, and he didn't know what to do about it, so he started taking down license numbers. And he'd be out all day long taking license numbers of these people that were going in, because he was going to call the police. Then he noticed that the police were showing up and visiting the house, and so he didn't know what to do. So finally he got enough nerve that him and his wife went over and asked her to leave. And she politely did so. And he said they cleaned up the place wonderfully, and he was greatly relieved. But in any case, this harlot, Rahab, was extremely nice as well. She knew that they were from across the river, an Israelite, and she knew of all of the things that had happened to them. She knew that they had defeated the kings on the other side of the river. She heard about them crossing the Red Sea. And she knew that their God was the God, the only God. And so she bargained with them, basically to save her and her household if she would not tell anyone about them. And of course they agreed, and they swore that they would take care of her. All she had to do was one minor thing, and that was to hang a red cord in the window. That was the minor thing. God would take care of the major thing. Anyway, she let them down outside the wall and she told them that to go north into the mountains and hide. And the soldiers, of course, came, and while they were there, she had hid them on the roof. They had flat roofs then, and she had flax on the top of the roof, and she hid them under there. And she lied to the soldiers that came looking after them. So we have a liar and a prostitute. What more would you want? In any case, she told the soldiers that, hey, you just missed them. They waited just before the gates of the city would be closed, and they took off probably down toward to escape. And she says, if you hurry, you can catch them. Anyway, they left looking for them, and of course we know they never found them. And then the spies went back and reported to Joshua. The funny thing about the spies in this case, we don't know their names. We know all of the names of the first original 12 spies, even the ones that gave a bad report, but these we don't know their names. In any case, Joshua told the people that in 3 days we'll be crossing the Jordan, to be prepared, to pack up and get ready to leave. And he said, when you see the Ark of the Covenant being carried by the priest, stay back from it, at least 1,000 cubits, and follow them because you don't know the way. In any case, they did exactly that. And as the priest took the Ark of the Covenant and stepped into the water, you know the story, it parted. And God held the waters back afar off. And why did he hold it back afar off, is the question. Anybody know why? Well, the answer is there were almost 2 million people that had to cross that river. And if it were a narrow place to cross, they would never make it in a week or 2 weeks. So apparently the path was so large that they could go across with their animals, with their carts, with all of their belongings, and get to the other side of the river. And then things get really interesting. I don't know which came first, but in any case, Joshua had a surprise for everyone. In this almost 2 million people, there were some 600,000 fighters. We know that on the side of the river that they were on, that there were the half-tribe of Manasseh, Reuben, and Gad wanted to stay on that side of the river. But Joshua told them that they had to send their fighting men with them, and they sent 30,000 fighting men across the river. And basically said they would follow everything that he said, and if anybody opposed Joshua, they would take care of them. And so we have about at least 600,000 men of fighting age. Not only that, apparently when the Israelites left Egypt and crossed the Red Sea, none of them were circumcised for that 40-year period. And so the surprise was basically, hey, you men, you've got to be circumcised. And probably some of them said, what does that mean? And then after they heard it, no doubt they said, none of me. But he explained to them, no doubt, that this was part of God's covenant. This was their small part that they had to participate in. Now, that was not something that a grown man would want to do, for sure. Remember when, Diana was raped by a prince of a nearby village. She was the daughter of Jacob. The prince wanted to marry her. And so her brothers said, hey, you can't marry her because you're not circumcised. And so apparently they thought about it, and they went back and they had the whole village circumcised so they could marry these nice young Israelite women. Well, 3 days later, they attacked him, and they went and they killed all the males in that village. That did not make Jacob very happy. Matter of fact, later on, he placed a curse upon them. But in 3 days, they knew that the men would not be worth anything as far as fighting is concerned. So here we have 600,000 men that can't do anything for at least, some scholars say, maybe a couple of weeks. Typically it's from 2 to 4 weeks before they're able to be semi-normal after that. And so, you know, they had to rest a while. And God told him to make, that is, Joshua, to make knives of flint. Anybody got any idea why he did that? Why flint? They had swords, they had knives. Well, the reason basically is we were at this particular time in what was called the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age was a period of time about 1200 BC all the way back to around 3300 BC. And all of the weapons were basically out of brass. Iron had not been generally distributed because of how hard it was to create it. Bronze, anybody know what bronze is? There you go, copper and tin. What percent copper? What percent? Very good. Anyway, during that period of time, we think that the bronze was about 12% tin. Tin is softer than copper. Why tin? That's basically true. If you take copper by itself, which has a hardness, I think, of about 2, tin has a softness of about 1.5, and it's much softer than copper. But if you take them and mix them together, the structures of copper is prevented from crystallizing, and so it creates a bond that is tougher. But even though it's softer, it becomes tougher, and it becomes of a hardness about 4 or 5 at the best. Nowadays, they put other things in bronze. They put magnesium and some other minerals to make it harder. But back then, they did not know a lot about metallurgy. But tin melts at about somewhere around 500 degrees for lack of comparison. That's not the exact number. Copper melts at about 1,000 degrees. Iron is 2,000 degrees, and that's the reason they didn't have iron. They didn't know how to take iron and create it out of the ore that they had. Now, some iron fell from the sky as meteorites, and the Egyptians had some knives that were made from meteorites. They had somehow taken and fashioned the iron that was in the meteorites and made weapons out of it. But as far as we know, the Israelites did not have that technology. Anyway, if you take a flint and you break it correctly, you can create a knife that's much sharper than anything that can be done with bronze or even iron. Some surgical instruments used to be made, maybe still are, I don't know, made out of flint. Flint has a hardness of, I think, 7, which is much harder than anything that the Israelites had as far as weapons are concerned. And so they could make an incision and do the circumcision real easy and real fast and real clean. What did they use for antiseptic? Anybody got a clue? The Bible doesn't tell us. Pardon? Okay, they could use vinegar, they could use wine. That would be ouch. They could use olive oil. They could use mixtures of frankincense or myrrh as an antiseptic, or they could use honey. How many of y'all knew that honey was a good antiseptic? And even you can use it today. If you have a wound and can't get to anything else, you can pour some honey on it. Anybody know why? honey is in such a fashion that it will basically kill anything in it because of, I think I would call it osmosis. It'll basically cause anything that it's with to explode because it'll be absorbed into the organism. Anyway, 600,000 men get circumcised because it was to make them have a covenant with the Lord. And so they rested a few days to heal their wounds. Do you ever wonder why the Lord had them walk around Jericho? Maybe this was the reason. They needed to get their strength back by walking. Walking is one of the best ways to get your strength back after you have any kind of surgery. And that's just my guess. Nobody says anything different, I don't think. But in any case, manna at this particular time ceased, and they could start eating of the fruits of the land, and it was harvest time. Now, when they crossed the river, it was at flood stage. Anybody got any idea what flood stage means on the Jordan River? It meant that it was way out of its banks. It could be typically 12 feet deep, and it could be around 100 to 200 yards wide. So it was not something you could cross very easily. When it was not at flood stage, you could actually ford it on foot. And the water would be around 3 feet deep. But even at that, you could not get that many Israelites across it without God stopping the flow. Joshua also told the men as they were going to cross the river to each tribe to take one man and go and collect a stone out of the river and take it to the other side. Now, if you were to be told to go get a stone out of the river, what size would you get? He said to carry it on their shoulders. How much would that weigh? 80 to 100 pounds would be the answer to that. The Bible doesn't tell us, but we know he wanted to make a monument, and it had to be that large. You're probably wondering why I'm coming up with all these idiotic questions, and that's not in the Bible, and that's my nature. My first few years of my life, I took things apart and asked why and how they worked. After I got through college, my basic question was, why not? And I spent 40 years in the industry creating things that never existed. I became an electrical engineer, and that's basically what I did for a living, doing things that no one had ever done before. And that was my job. We started out in the space race, basically for the moon. And one of my jobs was basically to test rocket engines. And I have a terrible curiosity, and I think about a lot of weird things. But one of my jobs at that particular time included among the testing of the engines for the Saturn V, which were F1 engines. They produced 1.5 million pounds of thrust. And our specialty at that time was to try to get the S-4B, which is the vehicle that took the men out of Earth orbit toward the moon, to test its engine. And it was a J2 engine, and it burned hydrogen. And it was one of the first burning hydrogen engines that was existing. So it was our job to get it done and get it done in time so that we could reach the moon by the end of the decade, as Kennedy suggested. And that's the reason I have these weird thoughts and these weird questions, because I want to look deeper. I think looking deeper into what happened increases your faith. And never be ashamed to question what's in the Bible. You may never find the answer. There may not be an answer. And I got ridiculed on occasion asking why certain things happened. But the Bible will stand on itself, and God may not provide us an answer, and it's not important for our salvation, that's for sure. But it's interesting to build your faith on things that you can find out by asking why or why not. In any case, God told them to walk around the city of Jericho. Now, Jericho was not a normal city. It was a gateway to the Canaan. It was doubly walled. That is, 2 walls were around it. The walls were basically rock, the first maybe 12 feet, and then from there up to around 30 feet was what we would call mud bricks, similar to those that the Israelites were making back in Egypt. And so we have a wall with rock and then mud bricks on top of that, and we had 2 walls. Between the 2 walls, they had houses built on occasion, and this is where Rahab's house was built. She luckily had this window that reached out from the second, or the outer wall. So it was a well fortified. It had a population, they believe, between 1,000 and 1,500 during this particular period of time. On occasions, it would have up to maybe 3,000 because soldiers would eventually come and stay there. And probably the prostitutes that existed during this period of time were probably one of the reasons. Back then, Canaan was a very evil area, and prostitution was practiced commonly, and it was not looked down on like we do today. And that was because the people were wicked. And it would have been no trouble for any stranger entering any of the earlier cities to be able to find the prostitutes and where they were, because they literally had signs or symbols on the ground to allow them to find their way. In any case, God had prejudged Canaan. Even 40 years before that, they were considered to be destroyed because of the evilness that existed within that country. And 40 years later, they had not got any better. They were still very evil. And so God basically had sentenced them to die. And we don't really think of harsh terms like that, but remember, God is what God is and does not stand for people who are against him. Idolaters and people that are working evil deeds. And so they had a sentence of death on them anyway. And it was Joshua's basically duty to take care of that. And it seems rather difficult for us to think in terms of going in and massacring a whole village, but that's what his job was. And it was ordained of God to do exactly that. And so basically they were told that they were to march around the city with the Ark of the Covenant, with the priests 7 priests carrying horns. And they did that for 7 days. Why 7 days? It might be to help the men heal. Anyway, it was about a mile, half a mile around the city. It was around 6 or 7 acres. And it would take about 30 minutes under normal conditions to walk around the city. I suspect it took much longer because of the number of people that had to walk around the city. In any case, the city was locked up tight during this particular time. Nobody was going in and nobody coming out, as far as we know. And so on the 7th day, 7 is a magic number, by the way, just like 40 years is a magic number that God has used in a lot of occasions, and you can remember a lot of things that were 40 years, and you can remember a lot of things that were 7. And then on the 7th trip around the city, the priests were to blow their horns, and everybody was to shout. The walls fell down. Now, did the shouting and the blowing of the horns knock the walls down? Of course not. It was God doing the major part. They were doing the minor part. And they were told at that point to rush into the city. And they were told to collect the gold and silver and iron and bronze to go into God's treasury. And so they went in and they destroyed everyone in the city, no matter what their age was, destroyed the animals as well. And they were victorious in doing that. And now later, they were to take on another city. Now, there's some dispute on what to call this other city. I heard it called most of my life Ai. It's also called A, It's also called Ai, and it's also called by other names. But no matter what they call it, it meant pile to heap, because that's what it ended up being. In any case, after their victorious taking of Joshua and his army taking the city, they knew that the next one would be very easy because they knew God would be with them. Incidentally, I guess we should add that there had been a lot of excavations in the area where Joshua took the city. Jericho is basically a pile of heap, even to this day. And there have been a lot of archaeologists that went in to dig to see what they would find. It started around a little after 1900. Some people went in and they dug. And then everything that they found supported what we read in the Bible. And in the 1950s, a lady, well-known archaeologist, went in. Her name was Kathleen Kenyon. She went in and she did a dig, and she claimed that no way Joshua could have destroyed this city because it was 150 years before it was destroyed. And so there was a lot of controversy about whether or not this was a true fact that was mentioned in the Bible. Of course, being believers, we know it had to be true because it's recorded in the scriptures. But she indicated that it wasn't. Well, years after that, another dig was done, and they went down through the layers of brick and debris, and they found this layer where it was burned of charcoal and other things like that. And in that layer, they found pottery that had been broken, that had wheat in them, that for some harvest. And they said, well, why on earth did she say it couldn't have happened? They come to find out her dating was due to pottery. And during that particular age, archaeologists used pottery to determine the age of what things happen. If they ran into a certain type of pottery, they would know, well, this is such and such BC. We can say basically the same thing. We can look at, say, cars. If you see a 1957, you know, Chevrolet, you know exactly what it is, and you know the year it came from. You see one a year later, like 58, you know exactly what it is. You see a Ford Fairlane of a certain design, you know the year it came from. And we could do that for many years. Now they all look alike to me. But in any case, they knew the pottery from a certain period. Well, they found out that she wasn't looking at the pottery that was there. She was looking for the pottery that wasn't there from another era. And she couldn't find any pottery that wasn't there, so she assumed that it didn't happen. But the people that dated it later found pottery that actually said, yeah, the period was around 1400 BC, which was approximately the period that we believe that Joshua took the city. Anyway, they sent out 3,000 troops out toward Ai to capture it, and it didn't work out so hot. They approached the city, and the men of that city came out. We think there was probably several thousand of them, maybe as many as 10,000. And they started slaying the Israelites. They killed 36 people. And so they turned around and they hid back toward their camp away from that city and gave up. Joshua was in terrible distress because of this. He fell before the Ark of the Covenant, and he begged the Lord to tell him what went wrong. He rent his clothing. He tore it, and he said, what did we do wrong? I thought you were going to be with me. I thought you were going to stay with me. And, of course, God told him that there's sin in the camp, and it's got to be taken care of. One person sinned, caused the destruction of the whole campaign that was going on. One person. And it was Joshua's job to find out who it was. And so God told him how to do it. And they brought before him 12 tribes. And he picked out the tribe that had the sin in it. Then the families came forth, or the tribes came forth. And finally it got down to, we always heard him call Achan, we can probably properly call him Achin. And he said, it was me, I did it. I saw, let's see, 100 shekels of silver, 50 shekels of a bar of gold, and a fine Babylonian garment. And I took it and I hid it in my tent. And so Joshua sent men to the tent to find it, and they came back with the booty that he had taken. And he confessed to it, and of course, he said he was sorry that he did it, but did that help him? Not the least bit. God told Joshua to destroy him and everything that belonged to him. And that's the sad truth of the matter. Sin corrupts. And to make a long story short, after they killed all the men, all the women, all the children, all of their animals, and they burned all of his property. They piled a big heap of stone on it, and at the day that this Joshua was written, that pile of stone was still there. Sin corrupts, and it's got to be taken care of. And we say to ourselves, well, we don't run into sin like that anymore. Well, I'm sorry to say that we do. People still steal from the Lord. I remember my father telling me about someone was stealing from the treasury of the congregation that he served in. And someone, they didn't know exactly who was doing it, but they hid somebody in the baptistry, and the plates were on a table out in front. And eventually somebody came by and took money from it. And of course they caught whoever it was. And that's not just an isolated incident. In a place a long time ago, we had a similar situation to that. So money was disappearing out of the contribution. One of the elders came to me and he says, Joe, says, we got a problem. I said, what's that? He said, somebody's taking money and we don't know how it's happening. So do you have any idea how we can catch them? He says, how about taking your contribution, instead of giving a check, give a bill. And we'll take down the serial number of that bill, and then we'll see if it comes through. Well, we did that for several weeks. And then one time he came, he says, that bill never came through. And we said, well, okay, what can we do? So what we did was we hid a camera and a speaker in the workroom where the counting was done, and put a video recorder on it. This was years ago when technology wasn't all that great. That we would record to see what was happening. And sure enough, with a sleight of a hand, we saw a $100 bill disappear. Just like that. It was slipped under I think it was a cutting board on the table. And it was done so fast, we had to replay it to see it happen. But the person that did it did not take it. We said, well, this is kind of weird, so we waited, and of course the room cleared out, and probably a half hour later, somebody else showed up and took the money, tucked it under his belt, and then we knew what had happened, and so we called him to the office, and he denied it, obviously. And then after he found out that we had recorded it, he confessed and promised to restore it. And by that time, we thought maybe somewhere between $700 and $1,000 had been taken. But sin is in the church, and it's got to be taken care of. And very few congregations do that nowadays. That is, withdraw fellowship. Of course, the sin that this fellow did was not open, and so that was fairly easy to take care of, but a lot of sin is open. I can't think of very many sins that aren't done in the congregation that we were at. I know of, this was theft, arson, attempted murder, adultery, fornication. during the period of time that we served there, over a period of 18 years, that happened in the church. And we had to withdraw fellowship from several prominent people. Some of them did not repent. Some repented years later. But it has to be taken care of because sin corrupts. And God knows sin corrupts, and that's one reason why he took care of this particular situation by destroying all of them. In any case, that was taken care of, and so God helped Joshua make a plan to take Ai. Basically, they would send several thousand men on the other side of Ai and hid in a valley. And it was very mountainous in that area, so it was easy to hide several thousand men in a valley. I believe it was west of the city of Ai. And there was a olive grove there, and so we think that perhaps they hid them there. And then Joshua and his men would go in from the beginning toward the entrance or the gate, and then they would go in, and then the men of Ai would come out and fight them, and then they would run from them. And as they chased them, the men that were in hiding would come out, and they would go into the city and basically set it on fire and destroy the people in it. And when the men that were fighting Joshua and his men went back and saw the city, they knew that they were ambushed and they were trapped, and they were all destroyed. And they captured the king. And so he was brought before Joshua, and so Joshua basically had him killed and hung on a tree. And that's where the concept of being hung from a tree mostly comes from. Him being accursed, being hung from a tree. In any case, he was killed, and he was taken to the front of the city just before the gates and left there, and they piled stones on him. Up until at least 25 or 30 years ago, that heap of stones were there, and it was 30 feet high. That's a big heap of stones. But they dug through the stones, and they actually found not his bones, but they found the gate of the city. Before, they didn't know where the gates of the city were. Anyway, the campaign toward taking the cities continued. During this period of time, the men of the Gibeonites came, and basically they knew that God was with Joshua and his men, and they knew they were up to be destroyed. And so what they did was they dressed in old ragged clothes, and they took bread that was molded, and they took wine skins that were old and ragged, and shoes that were worn out, or I should say sandals. And they went and they talked to the men of Israelites and Joshua and said, hey, we've come a long ways. We've heard about you and your God, and you know that he's powerful, and we want to make a treaty with you. And they made a treaty with Joshua, basically in saying, did not attack us. And so they swore that they would not attack them because they were from afar off. 3 days later, they found out that no, they lied. They were not neighbors. I mean, they were neighbors, and they were not afar off. So what do? Do they break the treaty, or do they keep the treaty? They kept the treaty, even though it was under false pretenses. Not only did they keep the treaty, God honored the treaty, which is kind of interesting. In any case, they said, well, you will make you servants. You'll be bearers of water and collectors of wood. And so up until the day that Joshua was written, that's exactly what they were. They were enslaved, basically, to collect wood and collect water for the Israelites. And then 5 kings got together under the king of Jerusalem to basically gang together and created a band of saying, we don't like what the Gibeonites did. Let's go down and destroy them for making their treaty. And so they did exactly that. They went down to attack the Gibeonites. Well, they sent a message over to Jonah and says, hey, we're being attacked, help us. And so Joshua took his men and went out after them, and they fought with them. And they were able to defeat them and run them off. But they had a problem. They did not get them all. And the sun was setting. And nobody fights at dark during that period of time. It's not like it is today. And so Joshua had the audacity to ask God to stop the sun from setting and to hold the moon in its place. Now, what would it take to do that? How do you stop the sun from moving? And how do you stop the moon from moving and keep the sun from setting? Anybody got any ideas on that one? Well, we say God is all-powerful. He can do that. Yeah, he sure can. But how did he do it? That's what I asked. How did he do it? Did he stop the earth's rotation? Let's consider that. What would it take to stop the earth's rotation? I told you earlier I worked with the Saturn V project. It would take 300 trillion Saturn V's to stop the earth's rotation. Can't be done. We can't do that. Man's not that smart. Man's not that powerful. God can do it because God has the power to not only create what he wants, he can control every molecule, every atom, and basically every atomic particle. He could have literally stopped the earth rotation. What other options are there? He could have moved the moon and moved the sun. That would be no big deal to God. There's a third option. Anybody got an idea what that would be? Light is made up of photons. They are constantly bombarding the earth. You can look outside, you can see the light coming through. Light has weight. God could have taken the light and moved it to where it would shine down upon the earth. And you would not know the difference between the real sun, because it would be the real sun, just bending it toward the earth. Well, how could he do that? Well, it's easy for God. He can control the particles. And we know light has mass, very minute. You say, well, how much mass does light have? The mass that hits the earth of protons in one day is about 135.5 tons. The light has weight and hits the earth, and it's collected by the earth. There's also other things that hit the earth. And actually, with all that hitting the earth actually moves, every year moves, because of all of the energy that hits it. How much does it move? Very little. Very little, not that they ever notice it. But God could have done it that way. But in any case, we know God controls everything. We got about 1 minute left. We sometimes don't know what miracles really are because we have nothing to compare them to. Remember when Jesus was out in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, and the devil came to him and says, well, why don't you make these stones bread? That was not a jest. Jesus can do that. What would it take for Jesus to make a stone bread? Well, a stone is primarily silicon. Bread is primarily carbon. What would it take to 1 ounce of silicon and convert that to carbon? Anybody got any idea? It's powerful. Man can't do that. Now, we can take uranium or plutonium and cause an explosion, but a terrific amount of energy can be released by 1 ounce of silicon converting it to carbon. It's sufficient to be the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. That's how much energy it would take to do it. But man cannot do that because we don't have the ability to make that type of change. And there is our final bell. Anyway, that was our rendition of Joshua. He lived to 110 years. And God basically said that he did all that he told him to do. And the only thing that we can find fault in is that tribe coming and making peace. And that's one reason I admire Joshua. Any comments or questions before we end? Yes, Ron?
Related with just that joke, one of my favorite passages of Joshua is Joshua 1:8. And God told me, "This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate in it day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written." And Joshua did not say, "Lord, when am I going to have time to do that? I've got to lead these people." And he did it all.
Yeah, he did it. I thought Terry was going to give away the subject Sunday. He mentioned a bunch of Bible characters, remember? He left out Joshua during that. And then he went on to quote Joshua later on, which basically said, "Me and my house, we will serve Jehovah." And that basically, thank you for your attention. I'm sorry I can't hear everything you said, but we enjoyed our study of Joshua, and he's a great hero. Let's have a closing prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're grateful that we've had this opportunity to study more about the greatness of Bible characters such as Joshua and the examples that he set. Help us know that we should do the little things that you ask of us, and you'll do the great things. Guide us, guard us as we depart, keep us safe from all harm. And we're so thankful for the rain that comes, that helps everything grow and nourishes our lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.